The first thing David registered was the rhythmic, almost hypnotic beep of a machine to his left. It was a sound that promised and threatened in equal measure, a metronome counting out the seconds of a life that felt, in that moment, utterly foreign. He kept his eyes closed. The dull ache in his head was a low, persistent drumbeat, a physical reminder of the screech of tires and the sickening crunch of metal. He remembered it all. He remembered the green sedan running the red light. He remembered the futile jerk of the steering wheel and the spiderweb crack of the windshield. He remembered the weightlessness, then the impact. Most of all, he remembered the thought that had flashed through his mind just before darkness took him. Is this what it takes? Does something have to break for me to see what's broken? He had been asking himself that question for 2 years. 2 years of walking on eggshells in his own home. 2 years of his architectural ambitions being framed as quaint hobbies, of his quiet nature being painted as a lack of drive. 2 years of his wife Clara looking at him with a carefully curated disappointment, a look that said he was a project she had taken on and grown tired of renovating. The accident, he realized, wasn't a tragedy, it was an opportunity. A terrible, clarifying, and irresistible opportunity. A small, radical idea began to form in the quiet of his mind. A blueprint for a structure he had never dared to design. He would pretend. He would feign amnesia. He would erase the slate and let Clara draw the map of their life for him. He would become a stranger in his own story. And in doing so, he would finally learn the truth of it. The thought settled not with a crash, but with a quiet, chilling certainty. The foundation was laid. He would not remember a thing. He would wait, and he would listen. Now, if you enjoy stories about hidden truths and dramatic reversals, I hope you'll stick around. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you haven't already, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support makes all of this possible. Okay, let's get back to David, who is about to learn that forgetting the past is one thing, but having it rewritten for you is something else entirely. He heard the click of the hospital room door, followed by the soft, expensive scent of Clara's perfume, a blend of jasmine and something cold, like money. It was a scent that always announced her before she spoke. Her footsteps were hesitant at first, then quickened as she approached the bed. He felt the light pressure of her fingers on his hand, a touch as tentative as a question. "David," she whispered. Her voice was laced with a convincing tremor of concern. "Oh, David, can you hear me?" "The doctor said—" "He said you were lucky." He kept his breathing even, his eyelids still. He had to commit to this. Every muscle, every nerve had to sell the lie. He was a blank page. He was a house stripped to the studs. "Please, David, squeeze my hand if you can hear me," she urged, her voice rising slightly. He allowed a faint, almost imperceptible flutter in his fingers, a neurological twitch, nothing more. He heard her sharp intake of breath, a sound of relief that was, for a moment, almost convincing enough to make him doubt his plan. Almost. But beneath the relief, he could already sense the subtle shift, the gears of control beginning to turn. She was no longer a wife by her husband's sickbed. She was a director facing an unexpected rewrite. "Oh, thank God," she breathed. "You're in there. You're going to be okay. I'm here. I'll take care of everything. I'll take care of everything." The words echoed in the silent theater of his mind. It wasn't a promise of comfort. It was a declaration of ownership. The play had begun, and David, the silent, unremembering protagonist, settled in for the first act. He knew it would be a performance of a lifetime, but he had no idea that the script Clara was about to write would be designed not to heal him, but to bury him completely. He listened to the steady beep of the monitor, a clock counting down to a revelation he both craved and dreaded. The truth was coming. He had only to lie still and wait for it. The door swished open again, and a new voice, cheerful and professional, filled the space. "Good morning, Mr. Allen. And Mrs. Allen, I'm Nurse Sarah. I'm just here to check his vitals and see how he's resting." David felt the nurse's cool fingers on his wrist, checking his pulse. He remained perfectly still, a statue of unknowing. Clara's hand retreated from his. He heard the rustle of her coat as she stood up, moving to the foot of the bed, creating a subtle distance. It was a small movement, but it spoke volumes. It was the posture of an observer, not a participant. "How is he, really?" Clara asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if David were not a person, but a subject of delicate negotiation. The doctor was so clinical. He said there was head trauma, some memory loss might be expected. "That's very common with an impact like this," Nurse Sarah said, her tone soothing. "The brain is a remarkable thing. It sometimes walls off the trauma to protect itself. We need to give it time. The best thing right now is a calm, familiar environment." David could almost feel Clara's mind latching onto the phrase, memory loss. It was the key she had been handed. Now she would see which doors it could unlock. "Familiar," Clara repeated, and the word was imbued with a profound, theatrical weariness. She sighed, a sound engineered for maximum pity. "That's just it, isn't it? I don't know what's familiar to him anymore, to us." David's heart, which had been beating with a slow, steady rhythm, gave a slight lurch. The beep of the monitor beside him remained constant, a testament to his practiced control. He was an architect. He understood the importance of a solid facade. "It can be disorienting for everyone," the nurse said, her sympathy evident. "But you're his wife. You're his anchor. When he wakes up, your face will be the first thing he recognizes, the first piece of his life he can hold on to." There was a pause. David imagined Clara composing her face into a mask of tragic bravery. He could picture it perfectly, the slight downturn of her lips, the widening of her beautiful, calculating eyes, the faint, sorrowful tilt of her head. "I hope so," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. And then it came, the first brushstroke on the blank canvas of his supposed amnesia. "It's just our life. It hasn't been easy. David, he's a good man, a simple man, but he's a dreamer. He has these grand ideas, these projects that never quite materialize." The words were like pebbles dropped into a still pond, each one sending out ripples of distortion. A simple man, a dreamer. She was framing him as a gentle, lovable failure, a man whose greatest crime was his own incompetence. "He's an architect, you know," she continued, a note of fond condescension in her voice. "Or he tries to be. He has a little studio in the basement of our home. My father helped us with the down payment on the house, of course. We couldn't have managed otherwise." Another pebble. "My father helped us. We couldn't have managed." She was painting a picture of herself as a long-suffering benefactor, shackled to a man who couldn't provide. David's fingers twitched under the thin hospital blanket, an involuntary reaction he quickly suppressed. The basement studio she spoke of so dismissively was where he managed the logistics of a multi-million-dollar sustainable housing development firm he had co-founded 5 years ago with his old university roommate, Marcus. The firm, Ethelgard Designs, operated under a discreet corporate umbrella, its success a secret he had kept, waiting for the right time to reveal it, a time when he thought it would be a joyful surprise, not a weapon. "He works so hard down there," Clara went on, her voice dripping with false admiration. "Days and days on these beautiful, intricate drawings, but they're fantasies, designs for buildings that will never be built, competitions he enters but never wins. I try to be supportive. I tell him they're wonderful. But in the end, it doesn't pay the bills." The lie was breathtaking in its audacity. 2 months ago, he had won the prestigious International Kellerman Prize for a low-income housing model, a prize that came with a $75,000 grant and a feature in a global architectural journal. He had tried to tell her about it, coming upstairs from his studio, his face alight with the news. She had been on the phone, planning a weekend trip to a spa with her friends. She had waved a dismissive hand, said, "That's nice, dear," and turned back to her conversation about which type of massage to book. The check was still in the top drawer of his desk, uncashed. The award, a heavy, sculpted piece of crystal, was hidden in the back of his closet. "So I'm the practical one," Clara explained to the silent, listening nurse. "I manage the finances. I have to be the one to say no. No to the expensive vacations he reads about. No to the fancy restaurants he wants to try. I have to be the bad guy. It's a burden, but I do it for us, to keep us afloat." A complete, stunning inversion of reality. It was Clara who craved the vacations, who booked tables at restaurants where the water cost more than a bottle of wine, who saw their credit card statements as a challenge rather than a warning. David was the one who quietly transferred funds from his business account each month to cover her lifestyle maintenance, as she called it. He was the one who ensured the mortgage was paid, the utilities were on, the illusion of her upper-middle-class life was flawlessly maintained, all from the profits of his fantasy projects. Maybe, Clara's voice softened, becoming thoughtful, almost hopeful. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise. David's blood ran cold. "Mrs. Allen?" the nurse asked, a hint of confusion in her voice. "This memory loss," Clara clarified, her voice gaining a strange, unnerving energy. "If he doesn't remember all the failures, all the disappointments, maybe we can start over. I can guide him. I can help him be more realistic. Maybe he can get a real job, something stable, something with a regular paycheck. We could finally be a normal couple." The word hung in the sterile air of the room. Normal. Her version of normal. A world where he was diminished, manageable, and eternally grateful for her guidance. A world where his secret, soaring success was erased, and he was rebuilt in her image of what a husband should be. A predictable, pliable accessory to her own life. He heard the nurse make a non-committal sound. "Well, the most important thing is his recovery. We'll take it one day at a time." "Of course," Clara said, her voice instantly reverting to that of the concerned, loving wife. "One day at a time. I'll be right here for him, whatever he needs." The door clicked shut, leaving David alone again with the beep of the monitor and the deafening echo of his wife's words. It wasn't just a distortion. It was a demolition. She had taken the beautiful, complex structure of his life, of their life, and declared it unstable, condemned, ready to be torn down. And in its place, she planned to build a prison, call it a home, and convince him it was a palace. The ache in his head was nothing compared to the profound, hollow ache that had opened up in his chest. His plan, born of suspicion, was now cemented by a truth more devastating than he could ever have imagined. He wasn't just testing her loyalty anymore. He was gathering evidence for a trial. And he, the silent, memoryless judge, would listen to all the testimony before delivering his verdict. For the next 2 days, David remained a silent observer in his own life. He allowed his eyes to open, but he kept them unfocused, vague. When Clara spoke to him, he would turn his head slowly, a look of blank confusion on his face. He was a quick study. He had watched enough movies, read enough books. The key to believable amnesia wasn't a total void. It was a frustrating, foggy landscape where nothing quite connected. He was an actor now, and this was the role of a lifetime. The stakes were his entire world. Clara, for her part, embraced her role as the patient, saintly caregiver with a terrifying zeal. She would sit by his bed for hours, holding his hand, recounting stories of their life together. But the stories were all curated, edited, and polished to fit her new narrative. She told him about their first date, but omitted the part where he had captivated her with his passionate monologue about the social responsibility of architecture. Instead, she described it as, You were so sweet and nervous. I thought it was adorable how you just let me do all the talking." She talked about their wedding, but focused on the fact that her parents had paid for the majority of it. "A generous gift to help us get started on the right foot," she'd said, patting his hand. She didn't mention his own contribution, a significant sum he had earned from his first major freelance design contract, which he had insisted on putting toward the wedding and their honeymoon. In Clara's retelling, he was a passenger in his own story, a lucky beneficiary of her family's status and generosity. The most painful part for David was listening to her talk about his work. She brought in a portfolio of his drawings from the basement studio. Not his recent, prize-winning work, he noted, but his student projects from over a decade ago. They were good, full of raw talent, but they were unrefined. They were the work of a young man still finding his voice. "See," she said, her voice soft and patronizing as she held up a charcoal sketch of a fantastical, cantilevered house. "You always had such a wonderful imagination, so creative. It's like a fairy tale castle." She smiled sadly. "But you can't live in a fairy tale, can you, darling?" He just stared at the drawing, his mind a whirlwind of fury and grief. That fairy tale castle contained the foundational design principles for the modular, eco-friendly homes his firm was now building in disaster-stricken areas around the world. It was the seed of an idea that had grown into a forest of real, tangible good, and she was holding it up as proof of his childish folly. Each word she spoke was a brick in the wall of the prison she was building for him. He felt its shadow growing longer, colder. By his side on the small rolling table sat his journal. It was a simple, unadorned notebook with a worn leather cover, the kind he had used for years to sketch ideas, jot down calculations, and manage his complex projects. It was his external brain. Inside its pages were the schematics of his success, the numbers and contacts that constituted his hidden empire. Clara had brought it in with a pile of his other things from home, tossing it onto the table with an indifferent air. "I brought your little notebook," she'd said, "in case you feel like doodling." Doodling. The word was so dismissive it was almost comical. She had no idea that the journal was a loaded weapon. He would see her glance at it occasionally, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes, as if it were a symbol of the very part of him she was trying to erase. He would let his hand rest on it, his fingers tracing the worn leather. It was a symbolic object, yes, but it was also a very real one. It was his anchor to the truth, a silent promise to himself that this fog of lies would eventually clear. He was patient. An architect knows that you cannot rush the curing of concrete. The foundation of his case against her had to be unshakable. The doctor, a kind man named Dr. Evans, was cautiously optimistic. "The scans show no permanent structural damage, David," he'd said, looking him in the eye. "Retrograde amnesia like this can sometimes resolve suddenly, or it can be a gradual process. We call it re-knitting. The brain has to find the pathways again." David had simply given him a slow, lost blink. "The best thing is for him to go home," Dr. Evans told Clara. "Familiar surroundings, routines, that's what will help the most." "Of course, Doctor," Clara said, placing a proprietary hand on David's shoulder. "I'll take the very best care of him. We'll get our old life back." Our old life. David knew she meant her new version of their old life. The transfer to a wheelchair for his discharge was a moment of profound humiliation. He was perfectly capable of walking, but to maintain the fiction of his fragile state, he allowed the orderlies to move him. As they wheeled him past the nurse's station, he saw Sarah, the nurse from his first day. She gave Clara a warm, encouraging smile. "You're doing a wonderful job, Mrs. Allen. He's lucky to have you." Clara's face glowed with the praise. She was the heroine of this story, the selfless martyr. The dramatic irony was a physical weight in David's chest. The whole world saw a saint. He saw a saboteur. The automatic doors of the hospital slid open, and the cool afternoon air hit his face. He was going home. But it wasn't his home anymore. It was her stage, and he was the main prop. Clara's mother, Eleanor, was waiting for them at the house. She was a taller, sharper-edged version of her daughter, a woman whose posture alone seemed to broadcast a quiet, unshakable sense of superiority. Her hug for Clara was long and dramatic. Her greeting to David was a pat on the arm, the kind one might give to a child or a pet. "Oh, you poor, poor man," she cooed, looking at him with an expression of pity so profound it was insulting. "Clara told me everything. Don't you worry about a thing. We're all going to take care of you." The "we" was significant. This was a team effort. The narrative Clara had constructed in the hospital room now had a co-author. The house, his home, felt different. It was the same space, the same furniture he had chosen, the same paintings he had hung. But the air was thick with their shared assumptions about him. He was no longer the master of this domain. He was a patient in it. Clara led him to the living room sofa. "Just sit here and rest, darling. Mom and I will get you some tea." He sat, his posture deliberately slumped, his gaze distant. He listened as they bustled in the kitchen, their voices a low murmur. But the house was an open-plan design, one of his own modifications, meant to create a sense of flow and connection. Now that very design served his purpose, allowing their whispers to travel clearly to where he sat. "How is he, really?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharp and low. "Exactly as I told you," Clara replied. "He's a blank slate. He just stares. It's unnerving, but it's also a chance. A chance to do what? To finally get him to sell this money pit?" Eleanor's tone was dismissive. She had always hated the house, a mid-century modern gem that David had lovingly restored. She considered it insufficiently grand. "Mother, please, not now," Clara hissed. "It's a chance to simplify, to get him on a proper career path. I was talking to Robert from the club the other day." Robert was Eleanor's brother, a man who ran a chain of hardware stores. "He said he always needs reliable managers. It's not glamorous, but it's a salary. It's a pension. It's security." David felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. A manager at a hardware store. That was her grand ambition for him. For him, a man who was currently overseeing the design and construction of a new public library in Seattle, a project with a budget of $80 million. The sheer disconnect between her perception and his reality was staggering. It wasn't just an underestimation. It was a willful, deliberate blindness. "And you think he'll just agree to that?" Eleanor sounded skeptical. "If he doesn't remember anything else? If all he has is what I tell him?" Clara's voice was confident, chillingly so. "I'm his wife. I'm his memory now. He trusts me. He has to. Who else does he have?" The question hung in the air, a testament to her arrogance. She truly believed she had isolated him, that he was an island and she was the only boat in the sea. She had forgotten about Marcus. She had always dismissed Marcus as David's nerdy friend, another dreamer with his head in the clouds. She had no idea that Marcus was the razor-sharp legal and financial mind of their partnership, the man who had structured their business to be both wildly successful and nearly invisible. "And the finances?" Eleanor pressed. "You said you've been propping things up." "I have," Clara lied smoothly. "It's been a struggle. I've had to dip into my own inheritance account a few times just to keep us from going under. He has no idea, of course. He just thinks the money appears." David closed his eyes. Her inheritance account. He knew for a fact that the account was nearly empty, drained by her shopping habits and spa weekends. The money that appeared was from him. He was the magician, and she was taking credit for the trick while complaining about the cost of the props. They returned with the tea. Clara knelt before him, placing the cup and saucer on the coffee table. She looked into his empty eyes, her expression a perfect blend of love and sorrow. "Here you go, darling," she said softly. "We're going to get through this. I promise." He looked at her, at this woman who was his wife, this stranger who was meticulously disassembling his life and his identity with the calm precision of a bomb disposal expert. He saw the confidence in her eyes, the absolute certainty that she was in control. She believed her position was unassailable. That was her fatal flaw. It was the flaw of the arrogant elite, the belief that those they deemed lesser were not just lesser in status, but lesser in intellect, in capability, in strength. They never saw the ground shifting beneath their feet until it opened up and swallowed them whole. David reached out and picked up the teacup. His hand was steady, his mind was clear. The humiliation was a fire, but it wasn't consuming him. It was forging his resolve into something hard and sharp. The quiet preparations had already begun. From the hospital, during a moment when Clara had stepped out to get some air, he had made a single, brief call. A call to Marcus. He had set a timetable. He had laid out the first phase of the new blueprint. The demolition of Clara's narrative was coming. He just had to let her finish building it first. The higher she built her tower of lies, the more satisfying the fall would be. The days at home unfolded in a slow, suffocating rhythm. David played the part of the broken man, and Clara played the part of the savior. She dressed him in clothes he hated, soft, formless sweaters and comfortable trousers that felt like a costume for an invalid. She made him simple meals, telling him, "Your tastes were always so plain, darling. You never liked anything too spicy or adventurous." This from a woman who had watched him devour Thai green curry so hot it made his eyes water. A man who loved exploring the complex flavors of Vietnamese and Ethiopian food. She was not just erasing his past, she was rewriting his palette. Each day was a masterclass in passive aggression and control, all delivered with a gentle, loving touch. She would read to him in the evenings, not the histories or architectural theory he loved, but simple, unchallenging novels. "Let's not tax your brain too much," she would say with a sweet smile. She managed his entire life. She answered his phone, screening his calls. "It's just a friend from your old college days," she'd say, hanging up on a colleague from a firm in London. "You probably don't remember him. It would just be confusing for you." Through it all, David remained placid. His face was a mask of serene emptiness, but behind his eyes, his mind was a fortress of activity. He was observing, cataloging, and recording every lie, every insult, every condescending smile. He was building his case, brick by painful brick. This was the list of grievances, the indictment he would one day read aloud. He thought of it in architectural terms. She was building a facade, a Potemkin village of their life, and he was taking careful notes on every fake window, every hollow wall. His journal remained on the coffee table, a silent sentinel. Clara mostly ignored it, but one afternoon, while she thought he was napping on the sofa, he saw her pick it up. She flicked through the pages with a bored, dismissive air. He watched her through barely slitted eyelids. He saw her brow furrow for a moment as she glanced at a page filled with complex equations and logistical charts related to a materials sourcing trip to Germany. Then her expression cleared, and a small, pitying smile touched her lips. She probably thought it was gibberish, more evidence of his fantasy world. She couldn't see the blueprint for a multi-million-dollar supply chain. She could only see the scribbles of a dreamer. She placed the journal back on the table, patting it once, a gesture of finality, and turned away. She had looked directly at the evidence of his true life and had been utterly blind to it. Her arrogance was its own form of amnesia. The quiet before the storm arrived on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after he had come home. Clara was in high spirits. She had arranged a meeting for him. "Darling, I have some wonderful news," she announced, sitting on the edge of the coffee table, her face bright with accomplishment. "My Uncle Robert has agreed to meet with you about a job." David turned his blank gaze toward her. "It's a management position at his flagship hardware store in Northwood," she continued, her voice full of forced enthusiasm. "It's a real career, David, with benefits and a path for advancement. Isn't that fantastic? It would mean we could finally have some stability. We could start saving properly. He simply stared. He let the silence stretch, forcing her to fill it. You'd be so good at it, she pressed on, a little too quickly. You're good with your hands, or, you like things, tools and things. It would be perfect. No more pressure to come up with these grand designs. Just a simple, respectable job. We could be normal. There was that word again, normal. Her suffocating, belittling version of it. The meeting was for Friday. This was her end game. This was the final piece of her new construction. David Allen, the failed architect, reborn as David Allen, the hardware store manager. The thought was so absurd it was almost funny. The humor was black, the irony so thick it was suffocating, but it was there. She was so confident, so sure of her victory. That evening, after Clara was asleep, David moved. He slipped out of bed, his movements silent and precise. In the darkness of their bedroom, he was no longer the slumped, confused invalid. He was himself. He walked with a sure, steady gait down to the basement. He didn't turn on the main overhead light, instead using the small lamp on his desk. The room, his sanctuary, was just as he had left it. The large drafting table, the detailed models, the rows of books, it was all here. It was the heart of his real life. He sat at his desk and pulled a small, encrypted satellite phone from a locked drawer. It was a piece of equipment Marcus had insisted they both have for secure communication on sensitive international deals. He dialed. Marcus picked up on the second ring. David, Marcus's voice was tense. I've been waiting. Are you okay? The plan is in motion. The portfolios are ready. The financial statements are certified. The legal team is on standby. I'm fine, Marcus, David said, his voice low but clear, the first words he had spoken in his own true voice in weeks. It felt strange, like using a muscle that had atrophied. It's worse than we thought. He quickly and quietly summarized the past 2 weeks. He told Marcus about Clara's narrative, about her mother, about the job at the hardware store. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. A hardware store? Marcus finally said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and fury. She wants the man who redesigned the entire waterfront for the Lisbon Expo to manage a hardware store? She believes I'm a failed dreamer she needs to save from himself, David said, a bitter taste in his mouth. She's blind, completely and utterly blind. So the meeting is Friday, Marcus said, his voice turning sharp, strategic. That's our stage. We don't wait. We move on Friday. I'll be there. Where is it? David gave him the address of the restaurant where the meeting with Uncle Robert was to take place. It was, of course, a place well above their supposed means, one of Clara's favorites. She was likely framing it as a celebration, a final grand gesture of her success in rehabilitating him. Bring the Kellerman Prize, Marcus, David added, a new thought striking him. The physical award. Put it in a briefcase. Consider it done, Marcus replied. Friday, then, the curtain goes up. Friday, David confirmed, and ended the call. He sat there for a moment in the quiet glow of the lamp, his real world surrounding him. He felt a profound sense of sorrow, not for himself, but for the man he had been, the man who had loved Clara so wholly that he had been willing to hide his own light so as not to intimidate her. He had thought he was protecting her, but he had only been enabling her. He had built their marriage on a foundation of gentle deception, and it had proven to be as unstable as sand. Now he had to tear it all down, not out of revenge, not out of spite, but because it was the only way to build something true and solid in its place, even if he had to build it alone. He switched off the lamp and went back upstairs, slipping into bed beside the woman who was dreaming of his smaller, safer future, not knowing he was about to detonate their entire world. The quiet was over. The storm was about to break. Friday arrived cloaked in a brilliant, deceptively cheerful autumn sun. Clara was a whirlwind of nervous energy and excitement. She laid out a suit for David, not one of his well-tailored Italian suits, but an older, slightly dated one that she felt was more appropriate for a man seeking a mid-level management job. It was another subtle costume choice, designed to present him as earnest and slightly out of his depth. He put it on without a word, allowing her to straighten the tie with a proprietary fussiness. "You look so handsome," she said, her voice filled with genuine pride. It was a chilling realization for David. She was proud of this diminished version of him. She was proud of her creation. Now remember, Uncle Robert is a very straightforward man. Just be polite, listen to what he has to say, and be grateful. This is an incredible opportunity. Be grateful. The words echoed in his mind as they drove to the restaurant. He was supposed to be grateful for the chance to abandon his life's work for a job he could have gotten in high school. The absurdity was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of his feigned calm. The restaurant was exactly as he'd expected, ostentatious, loud, and designed to make people feel important. Gilded mirrors, plush velvet banquettes, and waiters who moved with silent, judgmental efficiency. Clara sailed through the room like a duchess, nodding at people she knew, her hand resting lightly on David's arm, guiding her broken, handsome husband. Uncle Robert was already at a prime corner table. He was a large, florid man with a booming voice and a handshake that felt like a challenge. He gave David a brief, once-over look, his eyes lingering on the slightly too wide lapels of his suit. It was a look of instant dismissal. "Clara, my dear," he boomed, kissing her on the cheek. "And this must be the man of the hour. David, good to meet you. Heard you had a bit of a knock." He gestured vaguely at his own head. "It's so good of you to see us, Uncle Robert," Clara said, her voice shimmering with gratitude. "Nonsense. Anything for my favorite niece," he said, patting her hand. He turned his attention back to David, his expression shifting from familial warmth to businesslike appraisal. "So, you're an architect," she tells me. He said the word architect as if it were a quaint, slightly embarrassing hobby, like collecting stamps. David simply nodded, his gaze placid and unfocused. He let Clara do the talking. "He was," Clara interjected smoothly, her hand protectively on David's arm. "But after the accident, we've been reevaluating. We think something more stable, more grounded, would be better for his recovery, for our future." "Grounded is good," Robert grunted in approval. "Can't build a life on blueprints and pipe dreams. You need bricks and mortar, or in my case, drywall and spackle." He chuckled at his own joke. "So Clara tells me you're looking for a management track. It's hard work, long hours. You're not afraid of getting your hands dirty?" David remained silent. He was waiting. He had timed this with Marcus down to the minute. He glanced at the door. Not yet. "Oh no, he's a very hard worker," Clara assured her uncle. "He just needs direction, guidance. That's what he's been missing." The condescension was so thick David could taste it. She was discussing him as if he were a wayward teenager, a fixer-upper project in need of a firm hand. This was the moment. This was the pinnacle of her narrative. The scene was set. The players were in place. David slowly raised his head. He blinked, once, twice. He let his eyes focus, truly focus, for the first time in weeks. He looked directly at Clara. He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes at the sudden clarity of his gaze, but she mistook it for a sign of him coming around to the idea. He turned his head and looked at Robert. "Bricks and mortar," he said, his voice quiet but perfectly clear. It was not the voice of a confused patient. It was the voice of a man in complete command. Clara froze. Robert looked taken aback. "Excuse me?" Robert said. David leaned forward slightly. He picked up his water glass, his movements deliberate. "You're right, Robert. You can't build a life on pipe dreams. You build it on a solid foundation. You build it with the right materials. You build it with a precise, unassailable plan." Clara was staring at him, her mouth slightly agape. The color was draining from her face. "David, what are you—" He ignored her. He looked back at Robert. "The problem is some people can't tell the difference between a blueprint for a shed and a blueprint for a cathedral. They see lines on paper and think it's a fantasy. They don't see the engineering, the physics, the financial modeling, and the human impact it represents." He then turned his full, unwavering attention to his wife. Her eyes were wide with a dawning, horrified confusion. The mask of the loving caregiver was beginning to crack. "For example, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a conversational, almost gentle tone that was more terrifying than any shout. "You told me I was a simple man. You told Nurse Sarah I was a dreamer whose projects never materialize. You told your mother you needed to get me a real job to keep us afloat. You told me just this morning that I should be grateful for this opportunity." He paused, letting each statement land. Each one was a perfectly aimed stone, shattering the glass house of her lies. "David, stop it," she whispered, her hand reaching for his, but he pulled away. "You told me we couldn't afford nice things," he continued, his voice calm, methodical. "And yet, here we are, at Le Ciel, a restaurant where the tasting menu costs $400 per person, a place you booked on a credit card I pay for, to celebrate my new career managing a hardware store." Robert was looking back and forth between them, his florid face a mask of confusion. "What the hell is going on, Clara?" At that exact moment, the restaurant doors opened. A man in a sharply tailored suit walked in, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. It was Marcus. He scanned the room, his eyes met David's, and he began to walk toward their table with an air of absolute purpose. "You asked who else I had," David said, his eyes locked on Clara's. "You were so certain you were my entire world, my only anchor. You forgot about my nerdy friend. You forgot about Marcus." Clara's head whipped around. She saw Marcus approaching, and a new kind of fear, raw and primal, entered her eyes. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew, instinctively, that her carefully constructed world was about to be obliterated. Marcus arrived at the table. He didn't acknowledge Clara or her uncle. He spoke directly to David. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "The traffic from the airfield was heavier than expected. The flight from Zurich was smooth, though." He placed the briefcase on the table with a soft, definitive thud. "Zurich?" Clara echoed, her voice a strangled whisper. David smiled, a cold, sad smile. "Yes, Clara, Zurich, where my fantasy firm just finalized the financing for the new Alpine Archive project. A sustainable, carbon-neutral data center built into the side of a mountain. A project you would have called a doodle." He reached out and flipped the latches on the briefcase Marcus had brought. He opened the lid, revealing not papers, but a heavy, intricately cut crystal sculpture. It caught the light of the restaurant's chandeliers and fractured it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. What is that?" Clara stammered. "That," David said, his voice resonating with a quiet, final authority, "is the Kellerman Prize for Innovation in Architecture. It came with a $75,000 grant you told me was nice before you went back to booking a spa day. And this," he reached into the briefcase again and pulled out a sheaf of papers, "is a certified financial statement for Ethelgard Designs, the little hobby I run from our basement." He slid the top sheet across the table toward her. On it, in bold, black print, was the company's net worth. It was a number with 8 zeros after it. Clara stared at the paper. Her mind refused to process it. She looked from the number to the crystal award to David's calm, resolute face. The entire narrative, the one she had so carefully crafted and so completely believed, evaporated in an instant. She was not the long-suffering savior of a charming failure. She was the blind, foolish wife of a secret millionaire. The ground she had been standing on so confidently had been a mirage, and now it was gone. "And finally," David said, his voice softening with a deep, profound sorrow. "This is for you." He slid a single, folded document across the table. It wasn't a financial statement, it was a divorce petition. "I believe," he said, looking at her one last time, "that concludes our reevaluation of our future." The silence that followed was more devastating than any explosion. Clara's face, which had cycled through confusion and fear, now crumpled into utter disbelief. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at the divorce petition as if it were written in a language she had never seen before. The numbers on the financial statement swam before her eyes, mocking her, indicting her. 8 zeros. A number so large it was an abstraction. A universe away from the narrative of struggle and sacrifice she had so carefully woven around herself. Uncle Robert, who had been watching this unfold like a spectator at a particularly brutal tennis match, finally found his voice. He snatched the financial statement from the table, his eyes bulging as he read the figure. He looked at David with a completely new expression, a mixture of awe, shock, and a dawning, craven respect. The man of the hour had suddenly become the only man in the room. Is this real?" Robert stammered, looking from the paper to David. "It is," Marcus confirmed, his voice cool and clipped. He tapped a folder he was now holding. "As are the incorporation papers, the pending contracts for projects in Singapore and Dubai, and the intellectual property patents for Mr. Allen's modular construction systems. Ethelgard Designs is very, very real." Clara finally made a sound, a small, wounded gasp. "David, I don't understand," she whispered, her eyes pleading with him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, frantic confusion. "Why? Why would you hide this from me?" David looked at her, and for the first time he allowed the full weight of his pain to show in his eyes. "Why, Clara? Because I was afraid of this. I was afraid that the money would become the point. I was afraid it would change us. I wanted to build a life with you based on who we were, not what we had. I wanted to wait until we were so solid, so secure in ourselves, that the money would just be a tool, not a foundation." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "It seems I needn't have worried. You built your own foundation, one made of condescension and pity." He began to recite the list of grievances he had so carefully compiled in his mind. "When I was lying in that hospital bed, you told a stranger I was a simple man. You called my life's work a fantasy. You planned to put me in a menial job because you thought it was all I was capable of. You didn't just underestimate me, Clara. You erased me. You took a man who was building cities and tried to convince him he was only fit to stack shelves." Each sentence was delivered calmly, without malice, but with the devastating weight of truth. It was the moral mirror, and he was forcing her to look into it, to see the reflection of the person she had become. "No," she choked out, shaking her head in denial. "No, I was scared. After the accident, I was so scared. I wanted to protect you. I wanted to make life easier for you." "Easier?" David's voice rose for the first time, not in anger, but in disbelief. "You call that easier? You wanted to make me smaller, Clara, more manageable, an accessory that fit your life better. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a project you could finally declare finished. You weren't protecting me. You were caging me." Uncle Robert, ever the pragmatist, was already shifting allegiances. He cleared his throat, a loud, rumbling sound. Now, let's not be hasty," he said, directing his words to David, his tone now oozing a sycophantic respect. "Clearly there's been a massive misunderstanding. Clara, my dear, you've always been a bit dramatic." He patted Clara's arm dismissively, the same gesture he had used on David earlier, but now it was laced with impatience. "David, my boy, I mean Mr. Allen, a man of your stature, you can't throw away a marriage over a few poorly chosen words." "It wasn't a few words, Robert," David said, his gaze still fixed on his wife. It was a worldview. It was the lens through which she saw me every single day. The accident didn't cause this. It just revealed what was already there. Clara's denial finally shattered, replaced by a wave of frantic desperation. She reached across the table, her hands grasping for his. "David, please," she begged, tears now streaming down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. "I love you. I do. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I was a fool. Please, don't do this. We can fix this. Now that I know, now that I understand everything, we can have the life we always dreamed of." The words hung in the air, a final, damning confession. Now that I know. The admission was so clear, so stark. Her love was conditional. Her respect was conditional. Her entire perception of him was predicated on his value, a value she had just discovered was far, far higher than she had ever imagined. David gently pulled his hands from her grasp. The warmth and desperation in her touch felt alien to him now. "The life you dreamed of, Clara," he corrected her softly. "My dream was to have a partner who saw me, the real me, the man in the basement studio covered in charcoal dust, not the man on a financial statement. And you never saw him. You didn't even want to look." He stood up. Marcus stood with him. The meal on the table remained untouched. "Please," Clara whispered, her voice broken. "Don't leave me." David looked down at her, at the ruins of the woman who had been his wife. There was no triumph in his heart, only a vast, aching emptiness. This wasn't a victory, it was a tragedy. A story of a love that had died not from a single blow, but from 1,000 tiny cuts of disrespect. "I'm not leaving you, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but final. "You left me a long time ago, lying in that hospital bed. I just didn't have the courage to admit it to myself until now." He turned and walked away from the table, Marcus by his side. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of her stare, the weight of her shattered reality. The hum of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background as he walked toward the door, leaving behind the gilded cage, the uneaten meal, and the woman who had looked at a king and only seen a fool. The performance was over. All that was left was the aftermath. The immediate aftermath was a storm of voicemails, text messages, and emails. They began before David had even reached his car. The first were from Clara, a frantic, cascading waterfall of apologies, recriminations, and pleas. They swung wildly from, "How could you do this to me?" to, "I'll do anything, please just come home," to, "You owe me an explanation." It was the desperate thrashing of someone whose entire world had been pulled out from under them. Then came the messages from her mother, Eleanor. They were colder, more calculating. Eleanor didn't plead, she threatened, albeit subtly. She spoke of reputations, of the messiness of public divorces, of what people would think. She framed David's actions as a cruel, vindictive trick played on her innocent, loving daughter. She, like Clara, was incapable of seeing the truth because the lie was so much more flattering to her worldview. David didn't answer any of them. He had Marcus handle the initial communications through his legal team. He needed space. He needed silence. He drove not to the house he had shared with Clara, but to a sleek, minimalist apartment in the city center that his company kept for visiting executives. It was a place Clara didn't know existed. As he stood in the living room, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city lights, he felt a profound sense of dislocation. He was free, but he was adrift. He spent the first few days in a state of quiet shock, processing the sheer scale of Clara's deception, and his own. He had deceived her too, by hiding his success. He had told himself it was for noble reasons, to protect their love from the corrupting influence of wealth. But now, in the stark silence of the apartment, he had to confront a more difficult truth. He had also hidden it because he was a coward. He had been afraid of her judgment. He had sensed her ambition and her dissatisfaction, and instead of confronting it, he had tried to manage it from the shadows, hoping his love would be enough to eventually bridge the gap. He had been wrong. Love couldn't flourish in the dark. It needed the light of truth, however harsh. A week later, the legal process began in earnest. Clara, guided by her mother and a new, aggressive lawyer, attempted to frame the narrative in her favor. Her petition painted David as a manipulative, emotionally abusive husband who had used a tragic accident to gaslight his devoted wife before callously abandoning her. It was a masterful piece of fiction, twisting every fact to her advantage. But David had Marcus, and Marcus had a team that dealt not in fiction, but in facts. Hard, verifiable facts. They responded not with rhetoric, but with evidence. They had the certified financial statements of Ethelgard Designs for the past 5 years, showing its astronomical growth. They had bank statements proving that David had been the sole source of the couple's income, quietly covering all of Clara's extravagant spending. They had copies of the competition entries and the award notifications that Clara had dismissed as fantasies. The most damning piece of evidence, however, was something David hadn't even planned. Nurse Sarah from the hospital had been so moved by what she perceived as Clara's devotion that she had kept a small, personal journal of her shifts. When the story of the divorce hit the society gossip columns, as Eleanor had feared, Sarah read about it. Confused by the portrayal of Clara as a victim, she contacted David's lawyers. Her notes from David's hospital stay were meticulous. She had recorded almost verbatim Clara's monologue about David being a simple man, a dreamer, and her hope that his amnesia would be a blessing in disguise that would allow her to guide him to a real job. When presented with a transcript of the nurse's sworn testimony, Clara's legal strategy collapsed. The story of the devoted wife evaporated, replaced by the undeniable image of a scheming opportunist. Her lawyer advised her to settle, and to settle quickly. The choice was put to Clara. She could either accept the generous but final settlement offer David had proposed, or she could face a public court battle where every detail of her deception, every condescending word, every lie about their finances would be laid bare for the world to see. The world she cared about so much, the world of country clubs, charity galas, and social status, would see her not as a tragic heroine, but as a fool and a fraud. It was Eleanor who made the decision. Her own social standing was now at risk. The potential for public humiliation was too great. She instructed Clara to take the deal. The settlement was, by any normal standard, incredibly generous. David wasn't seeking revenge. He was seeking a clean break. He gave her the house she had never truly loved, but now clung to as the last bastion of her former life. He gave her a financial settlement that would allow her to live comfortably, if not lavishly, for the rest of her life. But it came with a condition, a strict, ironclad, non-disclosure agreement. She was never to speak of him, his business, or their marriage publicly again. He was buying her silence. He was buying his peace. The final meeting to sign the papers took place in a sterile lawyer's office. David saw Clara for the first time since that day in the restaurant. She was diminished. The vibrant, confident woman he had married was gone, replaced by someone who looked pale, tired, and haunted. She wore a simple dress. Her hair was pulled back without its usual perfect styling. She looked her age for the first time in years. She didn't meet his eyes as she signed the documents, her signature a shaky, uncertain scrawl. As she was leaving, she paused at the door. She turned, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of the woman he had once loved. "Was any of it real?" she asked, her voice small, almost lost in the large room. "Did you ever love me?" David considered the question. He thought of their early years, the laughter, the shared dreams, the genuine affection. It had been real, but it had been a different version of them, a different story. "I loved the woman I thought you were," he answered, his voice gentle but firm. And I think, in your own way, you love the man you thought I was. The problem is, neither of us was who the other person thought. She nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Then she turned and walked out of his life, forever. Months bled into a year. The divorce became old news, a forgotten piece of gossip. David threw himself into his work, but with a new perspective. He no longer hid his success. He stepped into the light. He became the public face of Ethelgard Designs, giving interviews, speaking at conferences, and championing the cause of sustainable, human-centered architecture. He found that the fear he'd had, that the money would define him, was unfounded. His passion, his vision, and his integrity were what defined him. The wealth was simply a tool that allowed him to realize that vision on a global scale. He sold the apartment in the city and designed a new home for himself, a masterpiece of glass, steel, and warm wood nestled in a quiet forest clearing an hour outside the city. It was a house that was unapologetically his, filled with the books he loved, the art that inspired him, and a peace he had never known. His basement studio was replaced by a magnificent, light-filled workspace that looked out over the trees. He heard whispers about Clara from time to time through mutual acquaintances. She had tried for a while to maintain her old lifestyle, but without the endless, invisible river of David's money, the facade was impossible to maintain. The house was too expensive to run. The country club membership was an unjustifiable expense. Her friends, who had been drawn to the glamour and status she projected, slowly drifted away when the money and the parties dried up. The last he heard, she had sold the house and moved into a small, respectable condominium, paid for with the remainder of her settlement. Her mother, Eleanor, had publicly lamented her daughter's terrible misfortune, never once acknowledging the role she had played in her downfall. Clara had taken a job, something in marketing. She was, by all accounts, living a normal life, the very life she had once tried so desperately to impose on him. The irony was not lost on David. It was a quiet, poetic justice that brought him no joy, only a sense of profound melancholy for all that had been lost. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost 2 years after the divorce, David was walking through a new public park his firm had designed as a pro bono project. It was a beautiful space, with winding paths, native plants, and a stunning pavilion that seemed to float above a serene pond. Children were laughing on the playground, couples were strolling hand in hand, and an elderly man was reading on a bench. He saw the real-world impact of his work, the community and connection forged by thoughtful design. His phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "You're not going to believe this," Marcus said, a note of amusement in his voice. "I just got a LinkedIn request from Robert, your ex-uncle-in-law, the hardware king." David smiled. "Oh, and what did he want?" "He's expanding his business. He wanted to know if Ethelgard Designs would be interested in bidding on the contract to design his new line of prefabricated, eco-friendly garden sheds." David laughed, a real, genuine laugh that echoed in the clear autumn air. The absurdity of it, the perfect, circular nature of it all, was too much. The man who had sneered at his blueprints now wanted to hire him to design sheds. "What should I tell him?" Marcus asked. David looked around at the park, at the life and beauty that had sprung from his fantasies. He felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure. The anger was gone. The hurt had faded to a dull scar. All that was left was the wisdom earned through the pain. "Tell him we're a little busy with cathedrals right now," David said, "but wish him the best." He ended the call and continued his walk, the setting sun casting long shadows across the path. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that true worth is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It is not measured in dollars or status or the approval of those who cannot see your light. It is something you must build within yourself, on a foundation of integrity, passion, and an unwavering belief in your own vision. He had been so focused on building structures of steel and glass that he had neglected the most important structure of all, a life built on the solid ground of self-respect. He had lost a wife, a home, and the illusion of a perfect life. But in the wreckage, he had found himself. And as he walked into the golden light of the setting sun, he knew, with absolute certainty, that it was a fair trade. In the end, the story of David and Clara became a quiet fable among those who knew the truth. It was a story about the danger of underestimating others, but also about the danger of underestimating yourself. David learned that hiding your light doesn't protect anyone. It only creates shadows where doubt and resentment can grow. Clara learned, in the harshest way possible, that respect is not a commodity to be granted based on perceived status, but a fundamental requirement of love. Her tragedy was that she only learned to value what she had when it was displayed on a financial statement, long after she had discarded the man who earned it. David never remarried, but his life was full. It was full of purpose, of friendship, of the quiet satisfaction that comes from creating things that make the world a little better. He built libraries where children could discover new worlds, homes where families could be safe, and parks where communities could gather. His work was his legacy. Sometimes, late at night in his studio, he would pick up that old, worn leather journal. He'd flip through the pages, past the complex equations and architectural sketches, to the very last page. On it, he had written a single quote, something he had read long ago, but whose meaning he only truly understood after his ordeal. It read, "The depth of the foundation determines the height of the structure." He had spent so long building a foundation for his marriage in the soft soil of deception and fear. Now he was building for himself on the bedrock of truth, and he knew with every fiber of his being that there was no limit to how high he could build. So what do you think? Was David right to do what he did, or was his own deception part of the problem? It's a complicated question, and I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. The heart of this story is about the collision between perception and reality, and how sometimes you have to tear everything down to find out what's truly real. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found this story compelling, please give it a like and subscribe for more tales of truth, justice, and the quiet strength that lies hidden within us all. Until next time, build your life on a solid foundation.